Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. And I think we've got most people now in. For those of you that I have not met, I'm Tom. I'm one of the co-founders of CertifID, also a wire fraud victim, large title agency owner, and a recovering attorney here in Michigan. And I'm just very excited to bring to you the last installment of this year's To Catch a Fraudster webinar. And we're going to go out with a bang here with our lineup. So this series really is meant to open up the conversation as a community around not only wire fraud, but what we're facing in especially the real estate transaction as it relates to cyber instances, threats, and how we think about managing these risks going forward. So without further ado, let me share my screen, which will keep me on track a little bit. We have a great panelist. I'm going to introduce these guys in just a second. We're going to walk through why they're on. They each have very, very interesting backgrounds as it relates to fraud and cyber defense. We're going to talk about our top cases of 2022, and then also kind of future pace from a lens of what we can expect going into 2023. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. And before I forget, because I will, I'd really like you to think through what topics and format you'd like to see next year. Many of you have been so loyal in attending every single month. We've getting really good reviews. We had an overwhelming response to today's session, but literally thousands of you have attended these over the year. And we just want to do our job to make sure that we're driving the level of value and knowledge transfer that's actionable for you, not only in your companies, but also in your referral partner and customer segments. So please put in the Q&A any thoughts you have around, hey, panel versus, presentation versus more working sessions. We're curating right now how next year is going to look. So unfortunately, Stephen, who was supposed to be with us today, fell ill. Like many of us with young children, and I am in that same boat. There's a bunch of bad juju going around right now nationally. And Alex, you and I were talking about that earlier. So it's he tapped out about 2 hours ago, and he's just ill. So Stephen is a superhero. We have two other superheroes on with us today. I'm just going to moderate this thing because these guys are amazing. But essentially, Stephen has been on the forefront of fighting crime and one of our federal law enforcement partners as it relates to wire fraud recovery, investigative actions, and just really thinking about this thing holistically. And when I say this thing, business email compromise, ransomware, some of the top threats. It was cool. I just got something in Slack that we had a vacant land, and we just recovered the full amount on a fraud that came in a couple of days ago. And that's because of our partners at the federal law enforcement level. So what Stephen would have said was ultimately he's riding the tip of the spear alongside all of us that are seeing these things coming in real time. And they're trying to balance between real-time actionable intelligence that us and other sources throughout the country provide to reclaim funds and try to make victims whole, and the investigative side where it takes, unfortunately, months or years to build a case for the Department of Justice for them to bring them to trial. But know that they work through all that. So anyway, if you have any questions on Secret Service interaction, put it in the questions panel. I'll do my best to get to it. In fact, I will launch that, so I have that on a separate screen here. Without further ado, Eamon, you and I have known each other now for a few months. You came in, we call you the fraud fighting Jedi, but tell us a little bit about not only yourself, you're working for CertifID full-time now, but you were also working for one of our major threat intelligence partners before we had the fortunate ability to pick you up and put you full-time on the team. So yeah, I'll let you run.
Yep. So my path to fighting fraud was kind of haphazard, just like everybody else, I think, that kind of came into this industry. I am a recovering financial trader. I started off at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Chicago Board of Trade. And I kind of rode that out, made a little career out of it. I started as a kind of a high school intern running orders, and that nexused into an actual career down there. And then I was, technical enough that the guys down there were like, hey, you know how to turn a computer on, so you're going to be our computer guy. So I learned how the order routing and all of that kind of operated on the trading floor and fell in love with it. Then 2008 happened and I fell out of love with it. Kind of ran around for a little bit, worked at Sun Microsystems and a couple other, tech firms and things like that, startups. And then I moved back to Chicago, started a couple of companies up in the mountains in Colorado and really kind of lost it for a couple of years there. Just snowboarding a lot. And then I moved back to Chicago and a buddy of mine from the trading floor said, hey, I've got this great idea. It's a gift card marketplace. So you can buy and sell gift cards. We don't actually hold any of the inventory. Can you help us, set up the payment systems for this? And so I said, yeah, sure, I could do that. And sat down with them. And within about 20 minutes, I'm like, you guys are going to have fraud problems. Like that this isn't really a payments play here. This is a fraud play. Like we've got to figure that out or it's going to tank you guys. They said, yeah, that's fine. We're just testing the waters out. And about 3 months later, they called me back up and said, hey, can you come back in here? And so I came back in and they had a laundry basket filled with paper chargebacks. And I was like, yeah, that's your new reality now. And so I started with them. In starting with them, I implemented one of our solution providers, threat metrics, and kind of became an expert in threat metrics. Threat metrics kind of integrated with us, and I did a couple of presentations and at trade shows with them, and they decided to hire me. So they brought me in, and I scaled with them. So I started basically the technical account management functions over there, and I basically owned all the accounts that weren't banks. So anything that was like online lending, any e-commerce, any of that kind of fell into my wheelhouse. And I bounced around in the solution provider space. I went to Shape Security for a little bit, and then I went to Prove, and kind of had another moment of I need to, go back on the kind of actionable side and building out programs. So I went to a challenger bank and I started on March 3rd of 2020. And so that went about as expected on starting anything on March 3rd of 2020. I got a week of working with my coworkers here in San Francisco. I was living in Denver at the time, and I had about a week of working with my coworkers here, and there was a boat out in the bay that had a bunch of COVID quarantines on it, and I was like, this is not going to be good, and it ended up not being good, but that ended up turning into an opportunity here at Certified after I kind of bounced around a little bit after 2020. I did more of a kind of a consulting focus on there, and then ran into Certified. And originally I was, talking to Certified. I'm like, hey, yeah, I think I just want to kind of consult and stuff. And Tyler was like, yeah, why don't you check out the website? And checked out the website. I saw your story and I saw how the company came to be. And I'm like, I'm in. That was about 4 months ago now. And, so here I am at this point. My official title is actually Fraud Fighting Jedi, which was probably the coolest thing I've ever experienced in terms of, they're like, think about what you want your title to be. And I'm like, maybe director of something, I don't know. And they come in and they're like, no, we were thinking like Jedi is better for you. So here I am now. And, in that 2020 phase, I also ran into Alex. And after watching a couple of the To Catch a Fraudsters, I was like, hey, I got a friend that is a reformed fraudster if you want to actually catch one.
All right, that's a great lead in. Alex, can you see my screen? So
Yes, sir.
So Alex Hall, I just recently met Alex, and I'm just absolutely fascinated with Alex, your story, and I guess courage to share it candidly. And Alex will acknowledge this. The first time I met him, I said, Alex, I want to punch you and hug you at the same time. So I'm having a weird emotional reaction. So Alex was a fraudster. And I would say, I'll say this, he doesn't have to. He was a fraudster at scale in the payment space. And what I understand of his interactions there, and I'll give you a little bit of a trailer on this, is, he was able to identify vulnerabilities and exploit vulnerabilities and monetize those exploits. And that should be a ding, ding, ding for all of us that are managing escrow accounts and managing multiple parties on a transaction, because it's all about monetizing, finding the exploit, that vulnerability, that soft spot, right? And then all of a sudden finding a way to say, okay, there's got to be a path to monetization. So Alex, I'm not going to do you justice. I'm gonna hand the floor over to you, give you a spotlight here, and why don't you read us in?
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Alexander Hall. I have 16 years of fraud-related experience, and as Tom was mentioning, roughly 10 of those years were spent operating as a fraudster. Where do we even begin? Isolating it to financial institutions, title companies, real estate, things outside of e-commerce. I think that the most important thing to understand is that as fraudsters develop their platforms and their methods and their practices and things like that, every piece of information and every touch point across the customer journey plays a point, right? If there's an opportunity to create an account, that's effectively a bucket that fraudsters can put funds into. I recognized this early on, and I expanded that scope out to everything else. If there's an opportunity to move money, how can I get money moved to an account that I control? If there is a need for an identity to exist in order to create an account or create a profile, how can I meet those needs of these systems? That's a very linear approach that I've just outlined. Also consider that there are systems now that interact with each other. So you create an account at platform A, platform B, platforms work together to ultimately deposit funds into platform D. That would be the end result. And as Tom had highlighted, there's many ways to monetize these different items, these different methods. So when I reflect on my time as a fraudster, I typically put it all into a package by saying, I was effective at exploiting systems for every company that I ever encountered. There's only one particular store that was able to beat me. That was a electronic store on a particular cross streets. Moving forward from there, I leveraged every piece of information that came to me, whether it was checks, credit cards, identity information, so on. Bank statements, social security numbers, personal identifiable information, the whole nine. Moving on from there, I was successful. I haven't yet calculated how much damage I caused, and it's definitely not a pride point. And then I was never busted. So at the end of my tenure, it was the birth of my daughter that caused me to put my life into perspective and understand that I need to be around to support her potential. That was the triggering effect for me. I dropped everything. I dropped everyone. I deleted files. I got rid of hard drives. I did the whole nine and just washed my life, my former life away. And then pushed forward to be a good guy and a good influence for my daughter. The first step in doing that was putting out a bunch of job applications, of course. I got picked up to do transaction analysis and chargeback representment processing for a vape distribution center. And that's when it really hit me as to how vulnerable these companies are. Metrics wise, I identified $2.3 million worth of losses. No, I'm sorry. I identified $1.2 million worth of losses over the previous 8 months, and further put practices in place to mitigate what was calculated to be $2.3 million worth of mitigated losses over the next 12 months. A lot of things went into place immediately, and I proved that I could be effective at stopping fraud, not just committing it. Moving on from there, as Eamon mentioned, COVID hit us all. So I lost my job due to a layoff. They automated my position, and I set out on my own. And now I operate under the banner of Dispute Defense Consulting / Alexander Hall to help with strategy development practices for e-commerce merchants, financial institutions, and everything in between, crypto and iGaming, all of those fintech categories. And now I'm working within the real estate world, so that's pretty cool. In addition to that, that's how we build strategies. That's the approach to building, to where I build strategies, I should say. Moving forward from there, I do training. Think like a fraudster. The biggest thing that Tom mentioned that is in my wheelhouse is understanding where fraudsters might attack. I offer training to financial institutions and all the subcategories to be aware of what different touch points and what different engagements and what different interactions stand to be exploited, are valuable to fraudsters, so on and so forth, and help put strategy items together to defend against the bad guys when they do seek to attack the systems. And then I also work with publications in various capacities centered around thought leadership. I've worked with some big brands. My work has taken me all across the country. I've worked with some of the biggest brands. I've worked with some of the biggest banks. It's been a lot of fun, and it's something, the biggest driving factor is that now I'm somebody that my daughter can be proud of. So yeah, for anybody who follows me, the daughter's the center of my universe. So so yeah, there's that.
Alex, I appreciate that. And any question I ask that you're not comfortable with, you can just say pass. Okay.
Okay.
I think everyone, I'll speak for probably everyone on the webinar today in saying, one, thank you for your courage to come back over to the right side of the ledger and be a force for good. I think you've got a very, very unique lens and set of skills from the time that you were operating, on kind of the dark side of the ledger, I'll say. And I'm not using this as an indictment or any type of shame or blame, but, would you be willing to maybe walk a little bit through the journey of how do you even become part of that network? Where is the entry point? Like, and maybe if you want to use it just anecdotally, even to say, how do people end up here? And what's the emotional, financial, maybe even security risk of people staying in? Because you and I have talked, you felt all three of those big categories. I mean, there's a tremendous gravitational pull that once you're in, you're going to stay in.
Yeah. So it's for me, it was growing up and not liking society. You look out and you think about people having things better and this and that. I also had psychological influence given to me by my mother, who, as we mentioned before we started the call, had the victim mentality. So like we always were looking out at the world thinking everybody, had a boot on our head, or we didn't have a fair shot, or any of these types of things. Armed with that perspective, our moral compass broke. We're born with this moral compass, and over time you keep punching it, eventually it breaks, right? So during the time of my operation, I adopted that it was mine to take, because those people were they were offending against me first. So with the bad situations, or the adopted mindset of the boot on the head of society, the 1% owning the 99, and that whole narrative, I adopted that, and it led me to believe that I should retaliate against this non-existent force that I was sold to believe and that I believed in. Because of that, it led to the second part, which is I didn't mind when I learned about drugs and all of the value of that. I did get tied into partying and drugs. I needed to support my habit, drugs, selling drugs, and then moving forward into fraud was a natural path, at least in Las Vegas. Going along that path, to your point.
So Alex,
now
I want to stop you a couple of things there. The victim mentality is interesting because, I'm a wire fraud victim. What we learned, and I've testified for the Department of Justice in a high profile trial in 2018, the Nigerian Black Axe was ultimately behind the syndicate that affected our title agency in 2015, which created our $180,000 loss. As it relates to victim mentality and the psychology and the culture around that, it's interesting because in Western Africa, they subscribe to the ideal that, look, during the colonialization, we got a really bad hand dealt to us. And we're going to essentially get our payback because there is this, you said boot on the head or whatever, there's this other force out here that did us wrong. And for that, why do I feel bad of just trying to get back to center? I'm trying to do my own level of course correction. And in what we understand in Western Africa, along with their voodoo religion that's kind of tied together there, is that they aren't seen as criminals. They're not seen, some of them are seen as, the community leaders you know, they're building the schools and improving the roads and they're paying off the government officials. I mean, it's just, I want to underscore the power of that because it's very, very real. However you ended up there, you know, it's real. And I think there's a large group of people that feel that way, which may have a natural tendency at either a intentional or unintentional level to say, yeah, I identify with somebody else should pay. And therefore I don't associate my action with the normal, like you say, moral compass, right or wrong.
Absolutely. And to the point that you made, there was a community out here. You know, people had kids and they were tied up in drugs and they were the victims. There's plenty of times where I'd buy them food and I'd help them figure out what they needed to do using the tools that I had, because collectively we were all victims of this societal narrative where we'll never get a leg up on the competition and we got to fight for our ends and we need to, you know, battles and fight and all that stuff. So it was very communal to an effect, where everyone helped each other. You know, there was a lot of camaraderie out here, centered around meeting the basic needs of the people that we worked with, because we were together in that. So you just highlighted that with the city streets and the schools and of course the government officials out there. Yeah, and that persists through to what I experienced in Las Vegas. Yeah.
So you found yourself in a community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So you move from using drugs, selling drugs. And then my question there is, how was it a half a step? Was it a full step away from you kind of work up the network and all of a sudden somebody introduces you to say, hey, there's more money somewhere else here. You know, rather than what you're doing right now, there's a lateral move that you can make even more money.
Yes. So in Vegas, the drug world and the fraud world are heavily connected. If somebody is out there doing heroin or someone's out there doing meth, chances are they have their fingers in a few fraud pots, right? Or pies, I guess is what you would say. Anyway, so it was more of a lateral movement. I was introduced to this whole structure moving from drugs to fraud. People are saying, hey man, for 10 minutes worth of work, you can go make a few $1,000s and this and this and that. It's because someone else had set up the system. Well, when I got over there, when I stepped over and started to investigate, I quickly identified that I didn't find these people to be very intelligent, right? So I quickly separated myself from their methods. If they set something up and asked me if I wanted to be a part of it, I'd ask how they were doing it and I'd step away. And I'd say, well, if they're doing it that way, it's obviously going to be saturated and they're obviously just minutes away from getting busted. So they taught me something and let me step aside and do it my own way. And it was at that point that I started to internalize that every system is the same, depending on how far you zoom out. There's always a bucket to put money into. There's always a bucket that the money is pulled from, these funding accounts. There's always a request to be made. There's always an account to create. There's always an interaction somewhere that allows you to, in a miscellaneous sense, affect the order that you placed or the request that you made initially. And when we zoom in a little bit, we start to realize that's account creation, that's logging in, that's enacting a transaction, that's building a cart, that's calling customer service and requesting them to change the fulfillment details or get out of that and turn into financial institutions. It's creating the account, it's depositing funds into the account. It's all of these steps, customer service to reestablish access because you employed some social engineering at the call center. It is any one of these things. It's all the same stuff to a fraudster. We spend so much time getting granular and thinking to ourselves that our operation is so unique. We need to stop, look back at it, look at our operation as through the lens of a fraudster. What can they accomplish by using our system, right? And so I started to apply that across, well, the entire industry. Refunds, returns, ATOs, identity theft, all of these items come into play at different levels and against different institutions. Yeah, and once that happened, it was just on. At that point, it became a game. It became, as I was mentioning to you before we went live, it became, here I am, some high school dropout, druggy, party guy, selfish, self-centered victim, and I can break that billion-dollar system and get money out of it. I can take advantage of this 200-year-old institution and get something out of it for myself to support me, my friends, my family, whatever it was. Then it became a game. How far and how elaborate could my methods become? And that's when the birth of what I was explaining earlier, the multi-system exploits, came into play. Take a platform that has low KYC over here, another one that has mid-level KYC, leverage that, turn up the wheels, manipulate the credit report, and bam, now you attack a financial institution. Multiple systems are in play there, and they can't cross-reference with each other. They just, it gets elaborate. And so that was the goal. How elaborate could I get? How big could I get? How far could I go without being detected? And how many combinations of systems could I use to reach the end result that I wanted to reach?
But on a personal level, Alex, the motivator, would you agree that at some point the motivator was less about money and more about your identity and self-worth within the network and what you were able to accomplish? Is that fair? I mean, at a deeply personal level, you were connecting much more than dollars and cents.
Yes and no, because the one thing that I think attributed to my not being busted was I didn't care if people knew that I was great. No, even though I helped when I could help, I was Robin Hood to an extent, a bad Robin Hood. I didn't collaborate with many people. There were people that I knew about, and there were people that would be delegated to and things like this. But I didn't work with many people, and honestly, I didn't care what their opinion was of me. This was me to myself, an intrinsic value. I accomplished this, and I kept most of my successes to myself, which is why you typically see fraudsters get something going and then they go and brag about it on the dark web. I interacted with the dark web for maybe 100 hours over 10 years of work. I didn't see that as a very reliable thing. I didn't toot my horn. I didn't go and buy Lamborghinis like you see these guys, that exploit the PPP loans. I operated under the radar. And so I didn't do lavish things. It wasn't millions and millions and millions and millions. It was just the sophistication of the method. It was what did I need? Can I meet my needs? And then go. So somewhere in the middle, I needed to meet my ends, and there was pride associated to it.
What's interesting you say that is that's one of the alarming things that we see. And, Eamon, maybe you want to jump into this, but we've had dark web searching conducted on real estate. And while you can buy BEC and, open source and all those kind of Kickstarter kits, there isn't a lot on like a full run out end to end on real estate wire fraud. And I think it's for that very reason. You're talking about dollars that are so large, they don't want to give up the playbook, right? They're going to sit there and say, look, the dark web is for whatever, but we've got a full scale operation that we're going to continue. And I'm wondering just if that could be some of the cause, because to your point, you were smart, you weren't flashy, you were under the radar, which is why essentially you were able to operate, I'm assuming, undetected for the better part of 10 years. Now you're running through your statute of limitations. So that rear view mirror is becoming much smaller from a risk perspective. But let's talk about getting out. We talked about, okay, so at some point you have the birth of your daughter, you have this, I call it Shawshank moment, and you say, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. Is it that easy? I mean, what does this look like day to day? Because I can tell you what, I mean, there's still a part of me based on who was involved in our trial that you kind of have a look over the shoulder effect. I got a guy in Tampa and 32 others that were convicted in this ring that are going to start cycling out of, these penitentiaries in the next 6 or 7 years.
It was immediately very scary. I heard about stories about Frank Abagnale and Brett Johnson working with the FBI and the Secret Service. That was in exchange for getting busted and taking I would assume it's some form of plea deal or some arrangement where they help and do things better. I didn't have that because I wasn't busted. So in one sense, it was better superficially. I mean, initially it was better to get out and go this route. But at the same time, anything that's still running and is associated to me, I'm still at risk for getting busted, so on and so forth. That's one angle. Two is I have to be as effective as possible to support my daughter, and then my ex-wife had 3 boys, and so I had to support all of us, and it was a big challenge to accomplish that. And then 3 was, as you just mentioned, criminal retaliation at any point. someone could hear what I'm doing, come across this webinar, come across any one of my podcasts that I've done, my roundtable series, any of these things, and say, hey man, you're encroaching on our work. Well, back in the day, I had muscle and influence, and I had authority in the community. Well, after cutting all of that off, no longer does that shield protect me. It's non-existent. So yeah, I live with that every day, looking over my shoulder to one extent or another. Whether the cops kick in the door or some gun-wielding psychopath, it's all very possible.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to go to just bring this down to somewhat ground level on the real estate side. I want to talk about the top recovery cases that we saw this year, and then we're going to walk through some of the trends. And Alex, I will ask for what your intersecting points were in real estate. You weren't necessarily real estate centric, but you did have some interactions in real estate. The largest recovery to date this year, just to do a 2022 recap, was a mortgage payoff fraud that came in, was this October? Late September. What was interesting about this one, and for those of you that are aware or maybe not, we launched our Payoff Protect feature for instances just like this. So how do we know when a mortgage payoff is being set up and set to release after disbursement has been authorized? So this was a house. It sits near the Austin, Texas area. It was a $1.7 million payoff that ended in a fraudulent account. Why we profile this one is not only was it the largest recovery, our largest recovery last year was 21.5 million, again, on a commercial refinance of an apartment complex that was sitting in the state of Texas. So we've had some big ones. What's interesting about this one is that, and I had to redact some stuff for privacy reasons, but let's say it said Acme Mortgage on the top, and that was the servicer. They went to the bank where Acme Mortgage held an account and created Acme Management LLC. So when we think about name matching through the Federal Reserve or the clearinghouse, that was one of those where this was a big payday. They had the money mule open up the account under a company name, and it was just very, very hard to detect because it was, Acme Management LLC doing business as Acme Mortgage, and all of a sudden you've got that kind of pull through. As you think about this, Eamon, you're back on. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry about that.
You've been seeing our fraud recovery efforts since you've joined the team. I mean, what is your perspective on, from just a fraud fighting standpoint, relative to like mortgage payoff fraud? Oh, he's froze again. So Alex, I'll spin to you. Mortgage payoffs are the largest disbursement typically in any transaction. And this is where you're paying off the seller's mortgage. As you think about exploits, where would this fall? So let's say, you reverse the clock 8 years, you were still active, and someone said, you know what, mortgage payoffs, there's a lot of money flowing through 20-some thousand title companies around the country. And the average purse on these frauds is, let's just say 280, 300 grand at the time.
I would zoom out and I would just look at the elements that are involved. Why does this person trust this organization, and how are they verifying? Say it's an email where the link is sent to start creating and start aggregating the data that we need. If it's going to be done over an ACH, we need the routing and the account number. We need all of these items to go into play. If I can make myself look, like you just said, with Acme Mortgage as some fake shell account that's made to represent Mr. the Acme company, how can I find out who is interacting with those people, what their goal is, start to build information from them and about them. Think about information being transmitted over email addresses. Consider every attachment that could then be secondarily viewed if someone gets access to emails, text messages, phishing, vishing, all of the things like that. do whatever you can to aggregate information, and then finally strike by saying, hey, we're ready to roll forward. X, Y, and Z. Here's all the details that we need from you. What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? And then, like I was saying before, every account and every transaction gets pulled from one bucket, pushed into another bucket. If at some point in the communication I can dictate that you put it in my bucket, then we're good to go. It's very superficial. It's a very high overview, but the idea is there. So for this particular use case, business, and then that's one route. That's going the route of getting the person to interact that way, the unsuspecting victim. If I can somehow access the inside of the true mortgage company, which this one I've never done, and I don't have any experience with this, so it's probably something Eamon should speak to. The same idea persists. We've seen all of these explosion of BECs, the business email compromises, popping up across the landscape. Instead of typing in one number, you type in another, and the process plays out appropriately. It's probably easier to go that route because the fraudster would just have to change one piece of information once the process is played out, one piece of information, rather than having to build it up against the personal victim. Two routes to go that way. Third, I would expect to say that if I knew money was going into an account, this is where the idea of third-party ATOs comes into play. If I were still operating that way, I would expect that I would expect to find that there's a truckload of funds sitting in one account. Well, exploiting the microdeposit system would be highly valuable to a fraudster. Create an unassociated fintech account on platform B, go back to established account, at financial institution A, link via microdeposit verifications, which is easy enough to do if you intercept a check or if you get a hold of viable business information or PII information, get a hold of the transaction information, verify the microdeposits, link the accounts, and start funneling out to the unassociated fintech account. Those are the three that come to mind that I would seek to exploit. The one that targets the victim directly, the one that manipulates the system of the operating company, the mortgage company, and then third is to just completely get out of that whole system and just exploit the bank account where the funds are sitting or where they land or anything like that.
Yeah, fascinating, because you weren't even primed with that question, and we hadn't even talked about mortgage payoff fraud. So I wanted to get into your headspace, because that's how quickly you would think through this, which is why I think, not that all of us can think like a fraudster, but it wasn't just one thing. It's like, we could do this, you could do this, you could do this. There's multiple points. The ATO is the account takeover, for those of you that aren't familiar with that acronym, and that's the email account, that's the trust account, that's on the other side of the bank account wall. Eamon, are you back? Can you hear us?
I am back, and hopefully we'll not lose connection this time.
All right. How do you think about mortgage payoff fraud and what we've seen at CertifID since not only launching recovery services, but now Payoff Protect?
Yeah, I think it's, the natural kind of evolution, right? So at first they would come in through one channel, and then they find another channel, and that channel's significantly more profitable because the amount of funds that are moving across that channel. And so fraudsters tend to kind of migrate, there's kind of two paths that they migrate towards. It's either the path of least resistance or it's the path of profit, right? And that's kind of my methodology. Is a very simple kind of breakdown, going back to my trading floor days, is fear and greed, right? And that's what moves markets. When you're working on a trading floor, like, that's, the advantage that you have on a trading floor rather than a screen, is being able to actually see the person across from you and kind of know like what position they might be in by not having like the appropriate poker face, or if they're yelling and screaming at their clerk. Fraudsters operate kind of the same way, right? It's kind of the same kind of zero sum, capitalistic kind of game for a fraudster, except they get multiple shots and they don't really have to worry about losses because they are losses. But in terms of that, it's just kind of a natural progression to move into the payoff portion of it, because the funds are moving. It's kind of like a forgotten aspect, because the actual customers kind of removed from it. So the actual, the emotional aspect of it is just the title agents going, all right, let's get this over with. Like, we've got, work to do and things like that. And I think that's what, fraudsters really kind of tend to focus in on is these flows where it's susceptible to higher gains and lower kind of preparedness in terms of seeing that vector attacked, right? Everybody's looking one way. If you can attack the other way, that's where they're going to go. And that's, kind of where guys like Alex come into play is, they end up developing out these strategies and then everybody kind of follows along in terms of like the account takeovers, back in 2012, ATOs were almost essentially unheard of. And then we saw probably about like 2015, 2016, they trained the botnets to run credit card numbers. So the CVV, they were training botnets to basically try to break CVVs on credit cards. So they would get the dumps from a skimming operation or something like that, but they wouldn't have a CVV. Then they would throw that credit card number into a botnet and try all these different sites. You've only got to break a code that's 999 unless it's an Amex. And then that moved into credential stuffing. So that moved into, hey, like, let's go ahead and use these botnets to throw username password pairs at things. And if they would get a hit, they'd send it out to thousands of websites. Now they're able to log into an e-commerce website. They're maybe able to log into their telecom website and manipulate the accounts that way. The other aspect, and this is one of the things that I was able to hear Alex speaking to before I lost my connection, was, if they didn't get it hit, right, then they could actually open an account utilizing that information. Like if they're able to get into that email address, and that just kind of changed the whole landscape. That changed the whole game. We went from this transactional kind of like, I don't want to say it was easy, but it was a hell of a lot easier than it is nowadays, right? And it kind of changed from the actual attack vector isn't just the transaction anymore. It's the identity behind that transaction and how that identity flows through the internet. And people's lack of understanding behind that is what really kind of fuels that movement.
In mortgage payoff fraud is tough because of the long tail of notice. That's why it's just so absolutely devastating on our industry. As a reminder, if you guys have questions, please put them in the questions chat. I'm monitoring that right now. So the top fraud prevention case this year just happened. So for those of you that may be new, we have a full recovery services division that all they do full time is recover funds that end up in a fraudster's account. Now, fraudster, from what we've seen, frauds typically are deployed. It could be domestically. A lot of them are deployed from overseas, utilizing a financier here in the States and a chain of money mules that move from different financial institutions to crypto wallets and tumblers and back out somewhere. The top fraud prevention was just a couple months ago, $605,000 mortgage payoff. Here's a situation where Mr. Cooper had properly sent in on one day 2 mortgage payoffs. I think it was just a kind of a double fax, but they had the proper one. And then the day after, an updated one came over. Using the payoff protect solution that we have, that information was inputted, immediately flagged, and then our team verified that it was in fact a fraudulent account and it was diverted. So with payoff protect, you're either going to get an instant decision because we know it's good or we know it's bad. So we have that kind of instant data set. But you also have a team of experts that have been verified not only by us from a training perspective, but by Lloyd's, our insurance company, that will go out and administer that due diligence, administer that verification. It was through that administration of the verification with Mr. Cooper, which many of you know is very hard because the account number essentially changes along with each individual loan. They don't use, account number ending in 001 to take in all mortgage payoffs, right? It changes. But here's one where they were sitting on and ready to fund against this updated payoff and fraud averted. So for those of you that are not on that tool, I strongly recommend. We spent over 2 years in development of this thing. There's machine learning. There's a ton of tech built into how we're able to ingest and verify in real time these records, because this in particular, this risk for the industry is kind of the lights out risk. Can't fully insure it. You won't know until the money's long gone and all of a sudden, you recognize there was a solution kind of upfront. So I want to talk about trends. We've got a few minutes left and I want to open it up to Q&A as well. I want to run through the first two of these, and then Eamon, I'm going to have you and Alex just kind of spar back and forth on the other three as they're a bit more technical in nature, and I'll get over my skis very quickly. Mortgage payoffs from an industry transactional perspective, the first two are transactionally related. Mortgage payoffs will continue to be the number one fraud vector simply because, like to your point, Eamon, I think you had a very common sense way to describe it. It's like the thing's done. Everybody left the closing room. All right, I got a few days to pay off the mortgage. It's like issuing a final policy. Really? I know I got to get them done. It's a necessary evil. And without that instant verification, it's like, okay, what's the tail of that risk? So for those of you that haven't been through a mortgage payoff fraud, it's when the seller receives a late payment notice from the mortgage company that was supposed to be paid off at closing. So that could range from whatever it is, depending on when the closing is. Typically, you think of it in terms of 30 to 45 days. Well, from a recovery standpoint, you have like today, tomorrow, or the next day. So we're running a 2 to 3 day cycle versus, anything beyond that, the chance of recovery is very low. So I think that's one we're going to continue to have to administer. Another trend that we're seeing, and again, I refer to this recovery that we just got notice of before this started, is vacant or unencumbered property from a lien perspective. So this is where they're going in, and this is the beauty of the open public record and the disaster of the open public record that we have of land ownership and lien encumbrances is that they don't have to guess. So if you think about, I want to target a buyer for 123 Main Street, I'm going to target somebody on the MLS that has the listing of 123 Main Street. And through the ATO that Alex was mentioning, I'm going to find the soft spots, I'm going to get to the buyer, and I'm going to divert their cash to close. Well, the same thing is they're actually they're finding properties that are either vacant. We've seen vacant commercial properties right now are a huge target. So vacant land sitting in a commercial district in kind of a whatever market center. Most of them that we've seen have been north of 500,000 a piece. So these are big numbers. They impersonate the seller. They hire a listing agent, typically an online discount brokerage. They never meet with the agent, but they list it. They go under contract, they do diligence, they set up for close, then they request a mobile notary. They impersonate a mobile notary in the state that they're sitting in, the documentation. They send in the mail away package to the title company. Title company funds against it. They go to record the deed. The deed's going to record, because it looks like the seller. And all of a sudden, you're sandwiched between a fraudulent, an impersonated seller and a bona fide purchaser under the Uniform Commercial Code. And for those of you that are lawyers, this is going to be a very interesting legal argument. So vacant land, unencumbered property, if there is a request to do a mail away, this is a transaction profile where you got to do a hard stop and say, who knows what on this thing? Who has met who? We're using now, just to let you know from our agency, the ability that we will not do this unless CertifID is used to verify the seller's identity. So this is an identity verification problem of who we think is the current landowner. And it doesn't matter if you're on a bifurcated market or you're just the closing attorney, you may or might not be handling funds. Anything vacant land, you got to verify identity. All right. Eamon, what a lead into identity theft. So where is identity theft moving? How is social engineering going to present itself next year? And how can we think about, some of those call outs for the people on the call today?
Yeah, so in terms of identity theft, I think it's moving in a direction where we can't even really successfully call it identity theft anymore. It's more identity compromise. I think, especially, kind of what's occurred over the last 3 years with COVID and lockdown and all of that, the scams now are changing, right? Like it used to be, the best way to do it, go onto the dark web, buy some fulls and go to business and, you're all set, right? It's a pretty easy. operation. I think with kind of the lockdown and everybody really kind of being forced to embrace a more digital level of communication, we're starting to see at this point more identity compromise, a lot of first party, that's just done through manipulation rather than theft, right? Like they're utilizing their actual identity, they're utilizing their actual credentials, right? And that's kind of scary because most of the systems have been set up not to avert this mule that is probably in some sort of romance scam or pig butchering, for lack of better terms. They're being manipulated, right? And so they actually have ownership of their identity, and they persist that identity ownership. But they're being controlled and manipulated by somebody that's a bad actor on another side. And a lot of times they don't even have any clue that this person's a bad actor, right? They've got a good story. Hey, like I'm in country X and I'm over here, I've got property in the United States, I'm trying to sell it, I need to utilize your bank account, and then I'll cut you in on this. And they won't, they're gone as soon as the money transfers, and then they're, not only are they accomplice, but their heart's broken. And we're seeing a lot more of that. You're also seeing a lot more of kind of allowed compromise. There used to be this scam in Chicago called card cracking. And it was kind of built out there, which is basically they would go out and they'd collect checks from folks, and then they deposit the check. It was very low tech. They put on a ski mask and deposit the checks into an ATM, and then take the $200 that was immediate access from that check. And they do this at scale. They'd go out and tell people, hey, I'll give you $50 for a check. All right, no harm to them. And that kind of mentality has been what's been adopted by other crime groups that are now involved with cybercrime, that we didn't see them acting in this, right? Previously to the pandemic, those guys were like, what are those nerds doing over there? Whatever, like, we're going to go sell our drugs and shoot guns or whatever. And now those are the bad actors that are involved. And so you have both of those kind of components, and I don't really know.
I mean, you're fading in and out a little bit. Alex, I'm going to move over to you. You want to impersonate me, but you want my actual credentials. How hard is that to get? How long does it take? And what would you expect to pay?
That's a huge question. I'll try to sum it up as quickly as possible. My goal of impersonating a person is to reach X output, right? So, okay, the first step is, what information do I need to do the thing, right? So, like, if a fraudster needs to get a hold of enough information to create a bank account, then they need a fully fleshed out profile. If they only need enough to create an e-commerce account to go test cards, fine. I'll tell you that in my experience, it isn't the idea of looking at somebody and saying, I want their identity. So that this moves on to answer the question about obtaining information. What I'm familiar with is how to obtain what I call organic information. So organic information is going to be something that does not come from the dark web, something that has had many hands in the pot, many hands touching it. Organic means, so when we see the rise of mail theft, when we see the rise of break-ins to people that house sensitive information and the data breaches, those are all organic data streams, right, that come in. So now once you filter through that, you come across identity profiles, right, fulls, like Eamon was saying. You come across identity information. Well, this is where the difference comes into play. Looking into what these profiles are worth and projecting what they're worth, what their potential credit value is, the credit rating might be, is what distinguishes whether or not we use it for a big thing or a little thing. Let's move into the big thing because we'll keep this short. The big thing, you can use identity information to, like I was talking about, third-party ATOs, to access the accounts of established accounts, to create new accounts, to do this and this and this and this. In order to accomplish that, you have to attack it two different ways. You have to adjust superficial information, email, phone number, shipping address, billing address, social media presence, X, Y's, and Z's, all that stuff. All of that research, fleshing out the profile, will ultimately give you the answers that you need if you know what questions are going to be asked on credit applications, account creations, so on and so forth. So now you have aggregated data input to be relied upon by the global landscape of the marketplace. And now it relies on that information that you've created and associated to the credit report. All of that's under established identities with thick credit profiles, and that's a really quick overview. Moving forward from there, we have synthetic IDs, which is a whole nother world unto itself. The idea of injecting data into synthetic IDs before striking is scary. I think synthetic IDs are going to be huge. And moving forward into 23, the data breaches, the mail theft, and all of this craziness that's going on aligned with the digital aspect that Eamon was speaking about. I think 2023 is going to be we're going to see a catastrophic explosion in the usage of identity information, because on the gradient level from 0 to 1000, right, all the way up, every single one can be used in different ways against established accounts or in creating different accounts. Identity information is wildly more viable than just payment information, and look at how much payment information has been exploited. I think that moving forward, identity theft is going to be insane.
So walk through a synthetic identity. I won't do it justice, Alex, but in 60 seconds, we had a question. So walk through what it is and how it's created, and then maybe I'll give you more than 1 minute, and then how it's monetized.
So quickly, I can say it's monetized the same way that that an established identity is. So there's the two categories, synthetic and established. So there's an established identity, can be monetized XYZ. Same thing applies to synthetics. The only problem is, based on what synthetics are, makes the value a little bit different and requires a little bit more work to get more money out of. So moving back to what are synthetics, it's my understanding that back in 2011, the Social Security Office, when they were issuing Social Security numbers, have begun to randomize them. No longer can you go back and predict based on the first 3 and the second 2 where and when the person was born. Now, in addition to that randomization, that means that people are less likely to be able to identify anybody without looking into a credit report. When you do look into a credit report, and because everything is randomized, issuers and establishments and financial institutions are more likely to allow thin credit profiles to be used for credit applications, for accounts, so on and so forth, as to not alienate anyone who justifiably has one of these randomized Social Security numbers. Well, what in effect happens is these thin credit profiles are being used with well, I shouldn't say thin, these non-existent credit profiles are unrelated to any Social Security number, date of birth, name, address, any of these items. So what people are doing is they're putting in credit applications at different places, inputting one set of information across 50 different applications. Thus, all of these credit inquiries, these soft pulls and these hard pulls, are going into the credit report and effectively making it reliable information. So what they've done is they've taken an unassociated Social Security number and an unassociated birthday and date of birth, or I'm sorry, date of birth and name, billing address, shipping address, email, phone number, and they've linked them together as reliable as per the credit report. Then secondarily, they go and attack, what I would attack, or what I am familiar with attacking: secured cards, prepaid cards, low credit cards, horrible credit cards, bank accounts for muling, the list goes on. The avenues for monetization are the exact same as traditional identity theft. There's just more building that needs to be done with synthetics.
So
I hope that was
you
within.
can take completely disparate pieces of information randomly, put them together, scale it across multiple different requests for credit, and because of the way the bureaus report back, it essentially creates this almost layer of truth, really out of thin air, that should never happen. And from there, then you can go out and get what would be some type of legitimate credit, whatever, line or credit card or something like that.
That's what everyone has reported. Now, that's one thing I don't have personal experience with in my past life.
No, and I've heard the same thing. I've heard people speak nationally on it, that is synthetic identity, where you're taking, it doesn't matter what, you sandwich it together, you scale it across enough inquiries, and the way the bureaus report back to say, must be somebody here. But to your point, you're not, because of the way fair credit works, you can't alienate people that are just entering the credit system, right? So they figured out a way to, I want to say gamify, but certainly hack their way around creating an identity for somebody that just, not only does it not exist, there's the relationship of the information has no correlation on an individual data point.
And this sounds crazy, but it's already what we do when we use aggregated PII. This is something I am familiar with, is when you inject information on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever it is, phone number associated with email, associated with name, that data is then being aggregated into a PII KYC vendor, and it's then being relied upon by e-commerce merchants to make accounts for onboarding of their KYC. So it's been in play for years. Now it applies to the credit profiles.
Alex, we're going to make you have a consulting company that we have a lot of large underwriters on. So we'll make if you give us a permission, your contact information available if they want to bring in someone of your caliber. I guess one parting thought, because we're at time now. How should the title industry be positioning itself? Like what would be the one thing that you would consult on right now to say you got to get this right in order to mitigate, let's just call it funds transfer risk?
Is that to me or Eamon?
To you.
Oh,
I get to
build
talk to
your
Eamon
strategy.
anytime. We'll bring Eamon back.
Okay.
Eamon's needs to put another quarter in his iPhone.
Build your strategy. First step with building your strategy is to zoom out. Look at all of the ways that point A, point B, C, D, E, F, G across your customer experience journey, across all of your processes, how they interact. Identify where bucket 1 drains and funnels bucket 2. Identify account creation. Identify what you're using to verify IDs or to verify payment information, account ownership, X, Y's, and Z's. That's 1. Build your strategy across all touch points. 2 is understand what I call the 3 dimensions of fraud prevention. It's not enough to validate whether information is accurate. We need to verify authority to the information. And then we need to look at all of the data that's available through third-party partnerships, such as with certified and processing and heavy lifting, in order to tell the story of what the intent is behind the interaction. Those are the 2 things. Build a strategy across your touch points, identify all your processes, zoom out. 2, read the data and understand what's happening. In order to identify identity theft or synthetic identity theft, it's going to be very important to understand the evidence that's available in aggregated PII to see that it's taking place. But that's a whole nother hour unto itself. So yeah,
and I'm sure you'll be welcome back. As it relates to synthetic identity, for those of you, and I'll leave with this, when they talk about mortgage fraud, the mortgage industry is struggling with that. That's different from wire fraud as it relates to the transfer of mortgage funds. So when we think about mortgage fraud, what the mortgage lenders and the warehouse lenders are concerned about is it's not a real borrower. It's somebody else that is putting in an application, or they're using, fake credentials or fake VOE and VOI information to qualify for it. But I know we're at time. Alex, thank you so much for just being a force for good now, man. I've enjoyed the time we've had together, and I trust this will be just a first step in our relationship. And I'll make sure that everyone has your contact information should they want to bring you in-house or talk one-on-one on how to dive a deeper level into thinking more like a fraudster. I think, unfortunately, we have to embrace a mindset where we have to think more like this so that we can behave in a way that is at least a half a click ahead of where things are moving. And Eamon, thanks for joining. I know you had connectivity issues, but all good, man. For those of you, have a wonderful holiday season. I hope everyone stays safe, and we'll be sure to, one last thing, or else I'm going to get brandished by my team. Please provide feedback to our survey that's going to come right at the end here. We do use this as a leading indicator into the type of content and what we're going to be doing next year. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you guys early in 2023. Take care.